We are poor little bears who have gone astray. Grr, grr, grr. Won't someone come and show us the way? Grr, grr, grr.
Dan has a background that includes interesting things. He is an official historian and a member of the Pacific Northwest History Guild. He is an accomplished musician, and he is an innkeeper, owning part of the Bush Inn in Index, Washington. Please welcome Dan Kerlee.
Thank you. Well, everyone, thank you for coming. I think this is possibly my third talk here, but for sure it's the first one that's been developed especially just for you. So you're getting to be the very first to hear it. We have over 70 images to see, and I hope that you enjoy each one as much as I did the first time that I saw them. So why Mount Rainier? Well, I was raised by campers, hikers, and educators, and Mount Rainier was among their favorite places here. We camped there often when I was young, trying out various campgrounds, but eventually settling in on Ohanapakash in the southwest corner. And there, a favorite evening activity was the slideshow ranger talks, where around a blazing campfire, we'd sing, "We are poor little bears who have lost our way." Grr, grr, grr. I won't make you sing it today, but to learn also about the natural history of the park. And I actually attended my last Fireside Ranger talk just last summer up at Paradise. So our talk today is a tribute to the Ranger talks, and it contains some things, though, that you might not hear at one. But we'll see and discuss some very special things, and you'll enjoy them, I hope. Okay, so how do we get a handle on such a complex subject? Well, let's try. We'll start with age. We will talk more about Rainier's geology, but what we see when we look at Rainier is actually relatively young. For example, the Tatoosh Range, or jagged peaks along the southern edge of the park, is up to nearly 50 times older. You heard that right. You've got a 500,000-year-old baby with a 26-million-year-old group of great-great-greats keeping an eye on it. Mount Stewart, near Leavenworth and visible from so many places on the north side of the park, clocks in at 40 million years old. But it's that young age that marks Rainier as a restless child prone to cause trouble. So its height, Rainier is a very high mountain, and at its tallest was even higher, maybe 16,000 feet or so. But it's only the fourth or fifth highest peak in the lower 48. And when you throw in Alaska, it's only the 17th highest. In fact, the United States has an amazing 45 peaks over 14,000 feet high. But what makes Rainier such a standout is its topographical prominence, 13,212 feet, which measures how high it rises from its surrounding. It's the third in all the U.S. after Alaska's Denali and Hawaii's Mauna Loa, which cheats by rising from the ocean floor. And in the lower 48, nothing else comes even close. So it's sometimes referred to as the tallest singular peak in the lower 48. Mount Whitney, its nearest neighbor, which is a little taller, has 3,000 feet less prominence. In fact, Mount Rainier is the 21st most prominent mountain in the entire world, more prominent than K2, and even the third highest peak on the planet, Kanchenjunga. The other major measurement of mountains is geographic isolation, which measures how far it is to the next highest peak. It can be measured in a couple of different ways. It's the 6th or 7th in the U.S., depending on which list you use, but really, aside from Mount Whitney in California, there's little within 1,000 miles that's any taller. Although most of us are surprised to learn that Mount Shasta is almost as high, just a few hundred feet lower. However, one fact is just indisputable. Due to its combination of location, weather, steepness, and glaciation, Rainier is by far the most dangerous climbing mountain in the lower 48. And so you'd think it'd be pretty cold up there, but the temperature on the top depends on whether you're inside or you've gotten somehow outside the mountain. There are vents in ice caves putting out steam at as much as 187 degrees. Handy if you're in there for the night. Rainier holds more ice than all the other Cascade volcanoes put together, and there's a baker's dozen major Cascade peaks. Although climate changing is causing some shrinkage, it still has approximately a cubic mile of ice spread out over 34 square miles, deeper than the Space Needle is tall in places. If loaded onto railroad cars, I'm told that that ice train would reach to the moon. Hard to believe, isn't it? And Rainier has, unfortunately, a massive amount of loose or breakable rock waiting to come down, 2 billion cubic yards over the Puyallup drainage alone. And here's one more chilling statistic. In the United Nations decade study of the 16 most dangerous volcanoes in the world, Rainier has the dubious honor of coming in at number 8. This is for a number of reasons. It's partly because of its proximity to so many people. And we're not in any danger here in downtown Seattle, so don't get up and leave until the show's over. Okay, and lastly, our mountain thus needs to be treated with respect, but not with fear. Hardy souls have climbed it, you probably guessed it, in nothing but what they were given by nature itself. Okay, well, we're going to discuss a number of topics, but in between we'll look at what we really like to do, enjoy the beauty of this beautiful peak and its surroundings, so we are going to take in some classic photo breaks along the way, because that's really what we like to do, is just look at the thing. This is a delightful 1920s view of the Tatoosh Range, taken from Paradise, looking to the south. It's hand-colored. It's unsigned, but possibly by Ashel Curtis, who was so heavily involved with the park for many years. Okay, mountain. This is a nice artist's conception of Mount Rainier erupting in the year 2117. Remarkably, there are only 600 fatalities in this hypothetical future event. But Mount Rainier is not the only mountain to rise at this particular point. This particular crack in the Earth's crust has been spawning mountains for some time. As we've already said, Rainier is actually quite new. The first Rainier eruptions were probably around 30 million years ago. Well, early humans on the planet go back 2.8 million years. Pre-Rainier eruptions occurred between 1 and 2 million years ago, building up a mountain that may have looked similar to Mount Rainier. So our new Mount Rainier was built up about 500,000 years ago, just in time to be ready for the first early Homo sapiens to develop about 100,000 years later. Humans arrived in our area approximately 20,000 years ago and have presumably been awed by it ever since. So Rainier's had at least 20 confirmed or suspected eruptions in the past 10,000 years, making it fit the definition of an active volcano. So especially here, note these little side eruptions here in this artist's view. They're not all coming out the top. Okay, there are different kinds of volcanoes. The Cascade volcanoes are a type known as stratovolcanoes, and this is your basic stratovolcano in action. Stratovolcanoes are built out of thick, sticky magma that tends to pile up, and they hold together while pressures build up. Rainier's magma is not as sticky as some. Rainier has a tendency to crack apart in places, if you remember that from the previous slide, rather than explode with the same sort of a total burst as Mount St. Helens. This, however, allows any internal moisture to boil, weaken, and break its structure apart and create a rock pile ready to fall down in a lahar, or enormous mudslide, potentially reaching Puget Sound as it has in the past, as recently as only 5,600 years ago. Okay, what's in a name? Well, to paraphrase, a mountain by any other name would be just as majestic, but that's never stopped anyone. And you can see some interesting things. You can try a few of those out if you think you can. The mountain has been talked about for over 10,000 years, but its first documented sighting by a European was by Captain George Vancouver in the spring of 1792. He named it to honor a man that he held in very high esteem, the very British Admiral Peter Rainier. A little over 10 years later, explorers Lewis and Clark did the best they could to record their sighting of Mount Rainier with the Anglo-phonetic spelling derived from Rainier's French ancestry and the one that we use today. Despite our unfamiliarity with him, Rainier was a noteworthy British naval officer, administrator, and parliamentarian who deserved at least to have something somewhere named after him. Given that his name is the one that first reached the outside world, was pronounced by a true discovering explorer, and has stuck for over 200 years, it's likely to remain with us indefinitely. We live in the midst of a host of locations named by the Spanish and the British, as well as Americans, but none has approached more than a sliver of the controversy that has raged around that of our highest, if not largest, geographic features. Rainier's cause is mildly hurt by the fact that he captured an American ship during our Revolutionary War, but while he was on sort of a Coast Guard duty in the Caribbean. Supposedly he thought he was going after a tax-dodging French privateer vessel, basically a government-authorized pirate ship, although finding it to be American would not have made much difference to him at the time. At any rate, he distinguished himself by leading the successful action and by getting himself badly wounded out of the Americas for a long recovery and eventually promoted up the ranks. Rainier was particularly distinguished for his work around and occasionally within India, where he was known for his ongoing bravery, humane treatment of his sailors, competent and straightforward dealings with his colleagues, and fair-minded, if colonial, dealing with the East Indians. Eventually he retired from the Navy and spent his later years serving in Parliament. Now our one portrait of him that we have here shows him in this new invention, a style of glasses designed to give extra protection to the eyes and protect them from the sun. The exact meaning of the Salish term Tahoma and its many variations is ascribed in more than one way. It was encountered early on by settlers and land explorers. It may mean mother of many waters, snow-covered mountain, or even larger than Mount Baker. Officially, Tacoma or Tahoma has been put forward many times for various purposes. The early writer Theodore Winthrop used Tacoma in one of the first books of this area's exploration. The city of Tacoma pushed for many years to have the mountain use the name, and today there is popular sentiment in many circles to revert to Tahoma. However, the U.S. Board of Geographic Names made a Rainier official in 1890 and specifically rejected a change when McKinley was returned to the native name Denali and confirmed Rainier again with a special status in the later 20th century. Okay, it's only in our own lifetimes, us here, that we've come to learn what Native Americans have always known. Tahoma has been used extensively for thousands of years. And so here, I'd like to read a statement from the park that shows the current level of understanding and sensitivity. The land administered as Mount Rainier National Park has been, since time immemorial, the ancestral homeland of the Cowlitz, Muckleshoot, Nisqually, Puyallup, Squaxin Island, Yakima, and Coast Salish people, including our own Duwamish. By following elders' instructions passed through generations, these indigenous peoples remain dedicated caretakers of this landscape. Their traditional knowledge and management of this sacred land will endure in perpetuity, and we honor each nation's traditions of landscape stewardship in our endeavors to care for, protect, and preserve the features and values of this mountain. For almost 200 years, popular culture inculcated myths about the Native relationship, or lack of it, to the mountain. Its name was known, but the story of natives living in awe but being afraid of offending its spirits by approaching its upper slopes was pervasive, even though many early ascents were assisted by native members. A typical sort of fable is one in a national park storybook privately published in 1934, where a chief attempts to retrieve part of a cache of valuable money seashells near the summit and is rebuffed by the spirits. So only relatively we, meaning the academic and popular majority culture, have come to learn what Native Americans have always known. Tacoma has been used extensively for resource, spiritual, and other purposes for a very long time. Alan Smith, David Daugherty, and David Rice did pioneering work in this area in the 1960s on a great many sites, including telling interpretation of their use. Many were discovered by the patient and insightful work of Greg Burchard, so we want to give a little tribute to these guys. They really brought the knowledge to us through our own culture. This map really tells the story. At least 40 sites within the park, many of them discovered only in the past 30 years. One site alone holds over 20,000 stone artifacts. And Tahoma's rich cake layers of datable volcanic ash show that humans were working in the upper subalpine areas before the eruption of Mount Mazama turned it into Crater Lake 7,200 years ago. So what attracted people to the upper subalpine forests? Well, as rich as the lowland forests are, alpine areas actually have a wider variety and amount of useful and attractive animals and plants. Many of them the same ones that we come to see, if not consume today. And yes, even some of our cuddly ones have provided food and material for warm clothing for centuries. Aww. Bear grass was used for basket decoration, lovage, ferns, and even the spiky devil's club had important medicinal application. Huckleberries were and continue to be a favored food item. And here is Muckleshoot tribal member Rachel Heaton preparing to summit Mount Rainier in early June of just 2022. Go Rachel! Okay, so let's take another little break, look back at the mountain. Here's another hand-colored view from the 1920s. This one's taken from the western end of the Tatoosh Range, looking north, back towards the mountain. Just beautiful stuff done in that era. Okay, but how did we get to a park? Hardy expeditioners making their way to the top of the mountain is one thing, but allowing the rest of us to enjoy it up close is another. Here we see a couple of about 1915 images. That brochure on the left is actually as much about promoting Tacoma. It says Mount Tacoma in the fine print at the top. And over there on the right, we've got a nice view of how one toured in the early days, taken in front of one of the first hotels at Longmire in the park's southwestern corner. So James Longmire discovered mineral springs on one of his early trips to climb the mountain, staked out a claim, and guest services were slowly developed in the lowlands at the southwest corner of the park. A couple of early quotes. Our lives forever demand and need visual images that can be symbols to us of the grandeur or the sweetness of repose. And studying the light and majesty of Tacoma, there passed from it and entered into my being a thought and an image of solemn beauty, which I could henceforth evoke whenever in the world I must have peace or die. That was Theodore Winthrop in 1862 in the Canoe and Saddle. And another, out of the forest at last, there stood the mountain, wholly unveiled, awful in bulk and majesty, filling all of view like a separate newborn world, yet withal so fine and so beautiful, it might well fire the dullest observer to desperate enthusiasm. That's what John Muir wrote in his book, Steep Trails. So the campaign to create Rainier National Park involved many groups and prominent individuals from across the nation, all pitching in. Muir's climb of Rainier happened almost by accident, as he was just visiting Paradise, but when the clouds finally broke and he saw it, he climbed it as fast as he could, right on the spot almost. But he threw the Sierra Club's influence behind the effort. And actually here we see Muir's top group right up on top of the mountain. Organizations as diverse as our local mountaineers and the railroads all helped to bring it about in 1899. And no discussion of our park is complete without mentioning Stephen Mather, who did so much for the National Park System as its first director. I always choke up a little when I read what's on his memorial plaque in our park and every major park. There will never come an end to the good that he has done. In the early days, a visit to Mount Rainier might involve taking a train trip, possibly across the country, and as part of a national grand tour. The railroads were eager to use the national parks to help build up traffic. Until the 1920s, many visitors would make the last leg by bus and would do the majority of their viewing in that way. Here we see the first ranger station and park administration center, the lovely little Oscar Brown cabin. Now, for the first decade of the park's existence, the rangers lived in tents until permission was given in 1908 to build a cabin. The rangers used it for all entrance functions until 1917, but it's been preserved and can still be seen today. Well, roads had to be constructed over a period of 50 years, and they had to be kept open. So that's the road up to Paradise on the left being built. And on the right, we see steam shovels clearing Chinook Pass, the highway to Yakima, which was actually built early on, close to the ancient native routes. Both the buses and what you could see from them, or from your car, if one was lucky enough to have it on in the early days, has changed over the years. Here we see how the Nisqually Glacier once came down to meet the highway, circa 1910. It's greatly retreated now, but its floods continue to roar down and occasionally take out the bridge at that location. Well, the coaches kept getting warmer and more comfortable over the years as the roads became paved as well. Eventually, the beautiful Paradise Inn was constructed in 1926. It soon will have survived a century of nearly complete burial in winter snows, millions of visitors, and unlike its counterpoint at Longmire, has never burnt down. Most of its lovely arts and crafts decorations can still be enjoyed, and I'll say its veranda is as fine a place to relax and enjoy the park's serenity and beauty as anywhere. And with a little patience and persistence, a room can be obtained in the high season. So there's always plenty to do, but the mountaineer always brings out an appetite, and food tastes good up there. If we take a look at the ice table here, there we go. Anyway, if we take a look at the ice table, it's cooled by winter snow from right in the park, and there's still plenty of it in evidence. Okay. I urge anyone who can spend at least a couple of nights up there to do so. However, if you're wary of amateur music making, I can tell you from personal observation that some things haven't changed in 100 years. The park and its amenities have been very popular since they opened and have added immeasurably to visitors' ability to enjoy a unique alpine experience. However, over the years, our sensitivities have changed as we realize that our ecological treasures are not invulnerable. Paradise's various developments and the valley's fabulous meadows became overrun within a few decades, with similar overbuilding taking place at Sunrise. The golf course even had a short life in 1931. This exemplified the resort potential. While the idea wasn't quite as over the top as the promotional image on the left might make it seem, possibly from nearby Pinnacle Peak on the Tatoosh Range, a very short season in the Great Depression economics limited the divot damage to a few months. It entertained golfers by day and was visited by bears, deer, and other animals at night. The legacy of a decade of planning, Mission 66 brought order and at the same time controversy to Paradise. The recreation industry's resort ideals were channeled into lower elevation and outside private facilities. Many of us probably remember the new day-use facility, a high point for some and an article of derision for others. Its windows provided comfortable views of the meadows, free from buzzing insects, glaring altitude sun, and gaspingly steep trails. Eventually it was named the Henry Jackson Visitor Center, acknowledging all that he'd done and tried to do. Its design perhaps inspired a bit by the Century 21 exposition a few years earlier in Seattle. It also arrived near the end of a period of freedom and funding for our national parks. Insufficient maintenance and desire to honor the park's earlier architectural heritage led to its replacement with a new Jackson Center in 2008. And here's another chance just to enjoy the mountain. This antique hand-colored photograph shows a very famous but sometimes puzzling perspective. This is Tiny Mirror Lake, actually one of several in the Indian Henry Meadow area up above Longmire in the southwest corner of the park. It was once reachable by automobile, later by bus, so very popular, but with road washouts it currently requires a very long hike and climb. But from this intimate angle on the steep west side, we get only a glimpse of the familiar ice fields of the crest. But that's the mountain right there. All right, a stamp and a scandal. The details of a famous controversy that reached deep into the halls of Congress and the country's administration is now little known, even in philatelic, or that is to say, stamp collection circles. The idea of featuring Mount Rainier on a postage stamp began with a test of Asa Curtis's iconic and intimate view of Mirror Lake and the South Tahoma Glacier. But it lost out to the still bridgeless Golden Gate. However, the election of Franklin D. Roosevelt in 1932 brought one of the most famous stamp collectors of all time to the White House, and with him, his brilliant campaign manager, James Farley. Well, it seems the post office was in trouble along with everyone else during the Depression, and Roosevelt made Farley his postmaster general. This friendly arrangement let FDR design stamps as well as create them. Farley wasn't a stamp collector, but the new Secretary of the Interior, Harold Ickes, was. So between them, they came up with many new designs, and Farley, the great marketer, decided to publicize each new design. So he would bring in reporters and pull a few uncut sheets directly from the printing press, and he'd autograph one for the president while giving a few more to his children, Ickes, and a few others as souvenirs. In 1934, the trio decided to boost sales with a set of 10 National Park stamps, and Mount Rainier was assigned the 3-cent first-class rate, which gave it very broad usage. The new stamp was first made specially available to the public at the Longmire Post Office as well as in Washington, D.C. Well, and to boost sales even further, the Rainier stamp was also offered in a special souvenir sheet, also handed out in uncut sheets from the presses. However, collectors began to express concerns that a rare collectible, potentially of great value, was being gifted to a privileged few. Thus the stage was set for the famous Farley's Follies. Although Farley assured collectors that the special sheets were only political souvenirs and would never interfere with the collecting market, a sheet of Mother's Day stamps was soon offered for $15,000 and pandemonium erupted. Collectors demanded that all of the special stamps be returned and destroyed, and opposition members in Congress demanded an investigation. Finally, a compromise was reached. The stamps, 20 designs in all, would be reissued uncut in large quantities for collectors. And of course, Farley was happy to oblige, because then collectors had to purchase these 200 stamp sheets to complete their collections. The scandal was re-raised over a 5-year period as Roosevelt's enemies continued to keep the alleged boondoggle in the public eye. But in the end, FDR's collecting became more famous than ever, and Mount Rainier and James Farley came out just fine. The ever-capable Farley went on to become the CEO of Coca-Cola for many years, and Mount Rainier became one of the most used features on our stamps, after Noteworthy Americans and Flags, with at least 8 different designs. The Grand Canyon trails at a distance 6. All right, here's a beautiful hand-colored winter view from Paradise, another 1920s production. This is by Seattle photographer Robert Bradley. All right, an aviation backdrop, second to none. In fact, it is said by some people that the best way to see the mountain is from the air, and those of us who fly out of SeaTac often get very spectacular views. Do you often choose your seat hoping to get a great view? Anyway, we've been looking at Mount Rainier from the air and also using it as a spectacular backdrop to show off our airplanes actually for many years, but just how long? This is a relatively early aerial photograph of Mount Rainier, and I like it because it was taken from an early Boeing biplane, a Model 8. This is a special one made for Boeing's first test pilot in 1920. That's pretty early if you think about it, just a couple of years after dogfights were taking place in World War I at far lower altitudes. The caption of this press photo explains that it was hot down below, but at this altitude the pilot could feel the coldness of the mountain. Well, at that altitude, it was probably nearly 50 degrees lower to begin with, and in 1920, the pilot would be in an open cockpit. Here's another one that's quite interesting. This is about 10 years later and claims to be the first flight over the top of Mount Rainier. The pilot, Frank Hawks, was preparing to set a Canada-Mexico speed record along the west coast and made what was considered a death-defying flight low over the crater of the mountains. The winds were surely very strong and turbulent. You can see that this is still in an open cockpit, and apparently his instruments froze. He had a chase plane with a cameraman along, flying at a safe distance to take this picture, or so the story goes. As aircraft technology rapidly improved, Boeing's designs helped lead the way, and Mount Rainier became a regular and spectacular backdrop for many of them. Here we have the famous Model 40, which helped pioneer many of the very first contract airmail routes in the late 1920s and 1930s. And color starts coming into our publicity shot. Here we have a late 30s view of early B-17s. And in the years after World War II, the airlines took advantage of our well-known tall landmark to show off the new pressurization features that were finally available to passengers by having the airplane shown high over Mount Rainier. Northwest Airlines flew the most luxurious airliner available, the Boeing Stratocruiser, to altitudes where the air was smooth and the terribly rough flights of the pre-war era were finally becoming a thing of the past. This photo shows that in 1946 there was still much to be learned about the mountain itself, though. The caption states that Rainier's fires have gone out, 26 glaciers clamped the mountain in an icy straitjacket. And the practice continues into the present. Here's a nice telephoto image of what was the brand new 787 Dreamliner. This is number 3 in a test flight telephoto from Boeing Field. An aircraft didn't just fly past the mountain. On April 12, 1951, John Hodgkins landed his ski-equipped Piper Cub near the crater of Mount Rainier, deliberately. Unfortunately, he couldn't get the engine started again, so he had to spend a miserable night on the summit. So attempts were made to rescue him, but he escaped down to Mowich Lake at 5,000 feet just as a climbing party was making its way up to him. But this image is actually of him up on Columbia Crest, taken by a search and rescue plane. So he attracted a lot of attention. And here, if you look right there, the arrow points to his aircraft taken from an Air Force plane sent out. Hodgkins barely beat the climbers, leaving a furious group to spend a miserable night at the top. But he needed more fuel to get down from Mowich Lake, and in the end, the military supply pilots were urged by their commander to just drop the gas on him. The best flying sighting, though, not only opened a special chapter in Rainier's history, but helped coin a new term and greatly expand a growing niche obsession. Now, we have a newspaper report from 1896 that a couple told the Tacoma Daily Ledger about a strange nighttime sighting. Looking out the window from their bed, Mrs. St. John and her husband observed a strange and very bright light in the sky near Mount Rainier. It flashed, with various colored lights shooting out, and it moved a great distance around the mountain before suddenly disappearing. In June of 1947, however, Kenneth Arnold, a respectable, level-headed Boise businessman who was out looking for a missing Marine airplane, was surprised to see what he thought were 9 very fast metallic flying objects following the mountain peaks from Rainier to Mount Adams. He timed their speed with a stopwatch to be an estimated 1,200 miles per hour beyond any known aircraft capabilities at that time. Now, he reported that they were able to dip and swerve around the Cascade Peaks like saucers skipping on water. So, although it wasn't the first report of such objects, a new term was instantly born. Another sighting was made that summer, and a very famous crash of an object in Roswell, New Mexico, helped create a legion of aficionados and private investigators. Thus, our area is forever associated with flying saucer speculation and study. Although the subject of UFOs remains controversial, and the analysis of what Kenneth Arnold actually saw ranges from otherworldliness to natural phenomena, skeptics have never questioned Kenneth Arnold's honesty, sincerity, and openness with details. And of course, on the left there, that is an artist's conception, not an actual photograph. Okay. Statistics vary, but nearly 500,000 persons have climbed Mount Rainier, currently around 12,000 per year, with about half of that making all the way to the top. Rainier is by far the most challenging mountain to climb in the lower 48 states and has been used for many training purposes over the years. So on the left, we see Faye Fuller of Yelm. She had dreamed of climbing Mount Rainier for 3 years before she made it at age 20 in 1891, earning the distinction of being the first woman to do so. Numerous younger climbers have made it over the years, but the record apparently is still Johnny Collison of Snowbird, Utah, who climbed it over 7 days at the age of 4 with his family. Here they are. He's the toddler behind his 6-year-old sister. If this sounds a little fluky, he at least seems to have been destined. By the age of 17, he'd climbed the highest peak on each of the world's 7 continents. So Mount Rainier was just the beginning. He and his sister went on to become very famous professional alpine and mountaineering skiers. And the oldest climber of Mount Rainier is currently Jack Painter, who reached the summit at age 22, just as a 7-year-old boy was heading back down. So we can take our own little climb to see what it's like. Here's a group up on the Paradise Glacier in the 1920s. Climbers were often a little more casual in their choice of gear in the early days. It gets steeper, and people climb for many reasons. It isn't easy. On the left, we see a man who came out from Missouri working his way up a steep snow face on the south side. Try that in thin air with a heavy pack. On the right, a couple is just hitting the top for their wedding ceremony, leading 11 others, including the mother of the bride. Now, for those who want a little extra challenge, the so-called infinity loop involves going over the summit of Mount Rainier twice while doing the 2 halves of the Wonderland Trail around the perimeter along the way. 135 miles and some 47,000 feet of elevation gain. And you wouldn't believe the sorts of speed records that people are trying to set on that. At the top of it's clear are fabulous views of the Cascade Range to the north and the south, the Olympic Mountains and Puget Sound, although the ocean is said to still be blocked by the Olympics. And many of us can imagine what that scene is like from being higher yet, flying in and out of SeaTac. But climbers can also explore an unusual feature, a vast system of volcano-top caves, extensive enough not yet to be fully mapped. On our Mountain of Superlatives, this is the largest such alpine collection in the world. Now, the caves have saved many lives, including the first summiteers, but it's not a pleasant way to spend the night. They are steamy and hot to one side, freezing cold on the other. People talk about literally trying to avoid scalding on one side while frostbite. And descriptions sound more like survival accounts than a cozy retreat from the outside blast of howling winds. And if you feel the need to be refreshed, a little climb down through the caves lands you in the world's highest lake, where steam coming from Mount Rainier's magma furnace keeps the water just above 32 degrees. I don't think these guys stayed in very long. Okay, anyone want to do the music on this? There are mountains in many parts of the globe, of course, and in English we borrow heavily from other languages to describe their features. For instance, the Cascades are part of the North American Cordillera, which refers to the long sweep of mountains throughout the West, including the Rockies from Alaska to New Mexico. And the term lahar, or massive mudflow, for which Rainier is famous, is an Indonesian term. Well, lenticular clouds often form over Mount Rainier. It's dangerously stormy inside, and they are often precursors of arriving bad weather. So here's a real lenticular stack, known in the Alps as a pile d'assiettes, for stack of plates. Well, the German language has names for some alpine things special to us here that we don't have. For instance, Little Tahoma on the side of the Rainier is a Nebengipfel. One of my personal favorites, though, is Brockenspector, where an elevated object projects its shadow against other distant objects or clouds, and Rainier regularly does this in spectacular fashion. You can actually do this yourself when you're hiking and the sun is low, making your shadow on the next peak. And these are actual unretouched photos, so they claim anyway. We can even combine languages, as a pile d'assiette is throwing a Brockenspector. And here we have a Brockenspector seen from the top of the mountain. You're there. All right. Well, it's always sad to leave Mount Rainier. For our last chapter, though we'll look at a different way to see Rainier, the mountain has attracted artists from the beginning. However, the way that it has been shown has varied over time. In the early years of Euro-American illustration, during a romantic period of art, getting the grand feeling rather than the exact detail was often important. This 1890s view from the Tacoma Hotel shows dramatic steepness and height. And of course, they're claiming it as Mount Tacoma there. In 1854, settlement was only marginally different than in Vancouver's time, and this railroad survey watercolor gives a period view such as Vancouver might have wanted to remember after first seeing the mountain from Whidbey Island. The famous Hudson River School artist Albert Bierstadt made a trip to the Lower Columbia in 1879 and created from descriptions a number of large canvases with exaggerated features to emphasize a site that few people at that time would ever see. Beautiful nonetheless. And John Muir created a large set of books about the West Coast, published in 1888, for which artists created images printed in photogravure. It's hard to recognize them as the outflow from the Nisqually Glacier on the left there, and a view of the Tatoosh Range on the right. After World War I, as more people visited the mountain, many wanted more realistic memories. Color photography was not yet common, and several approaches were taken. Painters became good at quickly making stock Rainier paintings that could be inexpensively sold door to door, often unsigned. This was also when many lovely hand-tinted views, such as we've seen, were produced. However, occasionally, tinters got the paint tube out and created striking photo paintings that give more than just the feeling of a painting, but at a reasonable price, and also allowed a different kind of exaggeration of color and reflection. That's what we see on the left. And this was also the era that yielded beautiful silkscreen images as part of the arts and crafts movement, as in this view from Aurora Peak by Waldo Chase. And of course, many wonderful, detailed, and realistic paintings were created through the years and continue to be. But as we moved into the mid-century, important impressionistic and modernist trends were also used. I love the sweep and the movement of this watercolor, done from one local artist's favorite hiking spots above Paradise. The Northwest Mystics are an important group of painters that had influence around the world, and this aqua tint by Joe Reno blends the heart of Mount Rainier with influences of international mystics as well. Maybe you can see a little John Muir over that. So perhaps this is not the way you thought you'd want to remember your beloved park. Might take a little imagination, but for me, this view of Rainier by the Northwest mystic J. Steensma captures the spirit of the mountain in a very special way. And one of the most wonderful things about our mountain is that more people get to discover it each year. Artist and author Chandler O'Leary arrived here a little over a decade ago from the Northeast and turned her artistry to our region, quickly adopting Mount Rainier as her favorite mountain and making many beautiful letterpress prints in a very classic arts and crafts style. She was featured just in March in the Seattle Times Sunday Pictorial magazine, and then sadly lost to us suddenly and far too young just last month. So I'd like to end with her alpenglow as a tribute to her and to all of the various climbers, scientists, engineers, administrators, writers, photographers, movie makers, and native guardians who've done so much to enhance our experience of this very, very special place on the earth. Thank you all so very much.
Thank you, Dan. Some of you may need to leave for dinner now. Others that have questions, I think Dan would take a few at this time.
What were they mining? You mentioned mining.
That's a good question. Of course, a lot of the mining was done of prospective stockholders, but there's a lot of coal on the northwest side of the mountain. It's down pretty low in that Wilkeson and the Carbonado area, but they were looking for the minerals that we find up here. I don't know if they thought they'd hit gold or not, but certainly silver and copper. Copper was a very important mineral in our area to mine. And prospectors were just all over the place trying to see, especially in areas that had some upthrust and not just lava. It has steam vents that can shoot out steam while you're just walking around the middle part of the mountain. This doesn't happen a lot, but it has happened in our day, and occasionally it's caused a little rock fall on people, so you don't want to step on any of them. It has an interesting cave system up at the top, which is so large that it has never been fully mapped out. It is the largest such cave system in the world, right on top of Mount Rainier. You can go down in there, and in there is, believe it or not, the world's highest lake. The steam vents melt some of the water, and hopefully here we'll get to see a picture of some intrepid souls giving it a try. But it does have the world's highest lake. It was greatly admired by the naturalist John Muir. He thought of all the places he'd seen throughout the West and perhaps even more of the world, he thought Rainier was just tops in a lot of ways, and especially the flower fields of Paradise. And if you go there today, even there's some steps up into the meadows, and they've got his quote that it was one of the most beautiful places he'd ever seen on the planet? Well, let's see. The park, of course, has been with us for over 100 years. It was the 5th national park, created in 1899, before we really had the park system as we know it today. And even at that early date, a lot of people came together to try to make it a national park. The amazing thing about the park is the amount of mining that's taken place on the mountain, or kind of on the lower slopes of the mountain. I can't give you the number, but it's more than a couple of dozen mines. And a few of those even maintained their mining rights after the creation of the park. How many people have seen movies with Mount Rainier in it, that we don't have the movies in this talk? Yeah, some people know. If you remember Sonia Heine in Thin Ice, there's a lot of views of the Tatoosh Range and other things. You don't really see the mountains so much.
Thank you very much. We have a round of applause for Dan.
Thank you all. You've been wonderful and patient.